from words. 38% come from the voice, the vocal variety, inflection, volume, as well as the pace of how we speak. 38% accounts for that. And a whooping, a big 55% is accounted by body language and gestures. That is a big number, 55%. And sometimes you might wonder why speakers do not capitalize on body language to bump up, to move up their levels of speech delivery. Now, are you all excited to learn how to apply body language in your speeches?
Yes.
That doesn't sound so exciting.
Yes.
All right. Now, I'm also excited. And my excitement is to share with you some tips and techniques that I gained from years of being a speech contestant, a speech mentor, as well as a speech coach for speech contestants. Now, essentially, there are only 4 components as far as body language are concerned: stance and body movement, gestures, eye contact, and facial expressions. And we will talk each of those shortly. For stance and body movement, what constitutes a proper speaking stance? Well, you just stand straight without feeling stiff, without being rigid. Your feet are 6 to 12 inches apart. Your shoulders should be relaxed. They should not be drooping, just relaxed. And finally, your arms are by your sides. The fingers are curled a little, so you should be relaxed. Standing on one spot. Body movement requires you to move a little, so avoid standing on one spot. Technically, there's nothing wrong with standing on one spot, especially if there's a lectern. World leaders do this. Presidents, they stand behind the lectern and stay there for the rest of the speech. But you don't want to be a mainstream public speaker, do you? You want to project energy. You want to project excitement and enthusiasm. And when somebody moves in front, what happens? The eyes of the audience follow the person who's moving in front. And the tendency is, well, hopefully none of those who are following you with their eyes sleeps, right? Because their eyes are busy moving, following you. Now, there are some movements that you cannot consider body movement, especially if they're really unnecessary. What are these movements? I can think of 3. One is when you're rocking, right? To and fro, like this, speaking. Another is swaying. Speaking while swaying, moving side to side, like a mini dance. And the third is pacing. Pacing is speaking this way, and then this way, and then this way. You're like a caged tiger in a cage. So those are unnecessary movements and do not contribute actually to the body language that you want to project. Now, how and when to move? When you decide to move on stage, how do you do it? The rule of thumb here is you use the left or use the foot that goes to the direction that you want to go. Okay? So if I want to go to the right, I move first my lead foot, and that's my right foot, and walk right, left, and then stop. If I move to the left, I use my left foot, left, and then stop. Or you can continue walking if you want to. Now, try to avoid crossing your foot when moving. Why? Number 1, it looks a little awkward. And number 2, you might lose your balance and trip over yourself. And we don't want that to happen. Now, when do you move? Typically, you want to move when you want to reinforce something in your message, when you want to illustrate, and you want to enhance the understanding of your audience on that particular message. All right, and I'll give you an example of this. And this is a few lines from a mini speech that I just thought of. And it is a speech in a hospital scene, right? And I'll try to show movement using this particular speech. So the scene is in a hospital, and I have a great sick friend. The nurse were running, scurrying, and looking for a doctor in the emergency room. And then I discovered that my friend was no longer breathing. I tried to make sense of what has happened and how I could have prevented it. And then I realized life is much too short. So there are two components in that particular mini speech, moving to the left, moving to the right and left. In the first part, I was discussing movement, but I was actually saying a transition in my speech. I was describing the movement, the scurrying of the nurses, they were running around, they're looking for a doctor. And then I stopped to make a point. And that point was that my friend was no longer breathing. The same thing when I moved to the left. I was walking, saying a transition about how this could have been prevented, and then I stopped. And that is to say, my point to illustrate that life is much too short. So did you get it? When I moved, you notice that I was transitioning, but I was also gesturing. And then I stopped to make a point. And that gesture leads me to my next topic, and that is gestures, which is the next component of body movement. All right. One of the things that commonly comes up is, what do you do in your arms when you're not gesturing? And the common advice, and this is something that even my mentor told me before, is just put them on your sides, like this, in the neutral stance position that we described earlier, putting them down by your side. Now, let me ask you, do I look awkward when I speak to you this way? Do I look okay? Yeah, many people would say, yeah, you look great. You look great when you just have your arms this way and speak. And when you do that, I would say, yeah, you look okay. You don't look awkward at all when you speak to me that way also. But the thing is, it feels awkward. Have you felt it? Just your arms by your side? It feels awkward. Why? Because the natural tendency for us humans is to cover ourselves up. When we are in front of a big group and you are giving a speech, you cover. You do this, you do this, you do this, anything at all, but you need to cover yourself. And when you put them down, you feel you're exposed. And that's the reason why we keep our arms in front of us. Now, many speakers, because of that feeling, what they do is they put their arms right in front and just have the fingers touching lightly. And that's okay. That is a little more relaxed and more comfortable. Just let the fingers touch each other without clenching, because when you clench, the tendency is you might get tense later on when you speak. So just like another hybrid position is to have one arm down and the other here. So when I have this stance, it's like I'm about to say something, correct? But I'm not actually saying anything, except it is a resting position that will allow you now to gesture. So you can have your left or the right, whichever predominant arm you have for gesturing, you use that. So that's a hybrid position. There are postures, though, that limit gestures. And one of the most common postures that limits gesturing is this, putting your arms in your pocket. Some people feel that they look cool. They look cool and relaxed when they do that. Except that it's probably too casual, especially when you are projecting yourself as a serious and professional trainer, for instance. And not only that, it drops the shoulder a bit. Did you notice? It's like an FPJ pose. So it drops the shoulders a bit and changes your demeanor when you put your arms or your hands inside your pockets. Another thing that it does is that when your hands are in your pockets, it's difficult to make gestures, isn't it? Because your pockets, your hands are in your pockets, and you could actually put them up. But the tendency is when your hands are in your pockets, you don't want to do that anymore because it feels a little cumbersome for you. So that's a posture that limits your gestures. Other postures that limit gestures are arms crossed. And the tendency is you don't gesture anymore when you do that because you're quite comfortable with your arms crossed. When you have a left turn, Toastmasters, when you have a left turn, that's another part of your delivery where you might not gesture anymore. Because the tendency is you use it, you hold on to it, you lean on it, and you don't want to gesture anymore. So those postures limit our gestures. If there are less gestures and are too little gestures or no gestures, is there such a thing as too much gestures? Yes, there is. Some people actually call them gestures when these actions are not. There are people that I see, they do this for the entirety of their speech. They're like juggling balls, small balls, and then they juggle bigger balls and much bigger balls for the entirety of their speech. They juggle balls. Now, speaking of small and big, there are small gestures. And when you talk to a small group, like for instance, I have a table here, you usually have a small window of gesturing, correct? From this size. But when you have a bigger group like this, you gesture up and out, up and away. Typically, the rule of thumb is your elbows are up your waist and out of your body. So the bigger the group, the bigger the gestures. Now, gestures above and below the waist. When I do this, what does it mean to you? What? One. Anything else? Okay. Or approve. Something that appreciates. How about this one?
Perfect.
Good one. Okay. At least that's what it used to be called. Okay. So it's effective when I do this, right? Or this. Anything about the waist. But what happens when I do this? Is it the same? Or do this? Is it the same effect? What does it look to you? Under the table. Some people might say, it's deceiving. Or, I look insincere when I do that. But it's the same place. It's the same place. It's just, the impact is a little different, isn't it? So there's a difference between above and the below waist kind of gestures. But there are exceptions. Like, for instance, a horizontal gesture that I like is when I discuss a timeline or a sequence of events. When I say the past, present, and the future. And beyond the future. So that's an effective way. It's like a timeline. Why do I say timeline? When you see a screen and you see a marking below, right? Or a banner. And there's a logical explanation to that actually. I don't say past, present, and future. But I say past, present, and future. Why? Because my right is your left, and my left is your right. And typically we read from left to right. So that's the logical explanation. Past, present, and future. So that's a horizontal gesture. Another gesture that I like is when you compare things like the past and the present, the new system against the old system, engineers and IT people here maybe, the old and the proposed, pros and cons. So it's a good way of, and the thing to remember here is when you're describing object A, you're always here. When you're describing object B, you're always here. Because your audience will always associate that you're describing object B when my gesture is here. And I'm describing object A when my arms are here. So just be consistent where you point your gestures. So there are horizontal gestures. And there are vertical gestures, like when you want to show a menu on the list, items number 1, number 2, number 3, 4. Or maybe a wall, right? You want to show. Another thing is the ups and downs of anything. Sales, for instance, sales projections. So those are horizontal, vertical gestures. There are so many other gestures that you can pick up. Eye contact. In general, we have 3 levels of speakers when it comes to eye contact. The first level are those that look at their notes, they look at their slides, they look at their notes, they look at their slides, and so on and so forth. They hardly look at the audience. And I've seen top-notch engineers do this, even in symposia. And they have a real good presentation material, but the way they deliver it, well, it can be improved. The second level are those who are more of the population. And what they do is they scan the audience, looking at the ceiling, they look at the floor, they look at the door, they look at the walls, and they typically look at the audience, but more of what's above their head rather than the eyes of the audience. And finally, the third level, which we all aspire to be as far as eye contact is concerned, is when you look people directly in the eye. Make direct eye contact. What does that mean? I look at you and I spend 3 to 5 seconds. I go to the next thought, spend 3 to 5 seconds, and so on and so forth. How long? Well, the rule of thumb is after a thought, a phrase, or maybe a sentence, and then move to the next. That's how you make direct eye contact. Now you might say, Sir, yes, doesn't that make the people feel awkward when you look at them straight in the eye? Do I make you feel awkward when I look you straight in the eye? No, it doesn't. When I'm part of the audience, I would feel, hey, this guy's really speaking to me in his presentation. The guy's really engaging me in his presentation. And I feel much more involved when this speaker speaks to me that way. Include everyone. The tendency for most people is where do they look when they speak to the audience? Well, they choose their friends. Some they do that. Some Toastmasters, they look at the evaluators. Some they look at the dignitaries. Or some guys where they look at a bunch of pretty ladies in the audience. But don't do that. Try to include as much as possible everyone. Like for instance, I don't include the people there. What will happen? What do you think? They feel ignored, right? Neglected. And sadly, the feeling is mutual. They ignore me back. And what happens then is that the connection breaks. There's no connection, there's no engagement. So be sure to include as much as possible everyone. Partition the audience. Now you may say, tell me, can you look everyone in the audience? Obviously not, especially if you have 1,000 people in your audience. So what do? You partition the audience into sections. Like an audience this big, you could probably partition it into 6 sections. If it's deeper, you could probably partition those at the back and other sections. And then you move from one section to the next. You stick to one section, looking one person, move to the next section, another person, the next section, another person, so on and so forth. There's no set pattern. You could move this way, you could move in a W or M pattern, or a random pattern. The thing is, you need to involve people in that particular section. One metaphor that I like, is to imagine your audience like a pond. And what you have are pebbles. What do you do with the pebbles? You drop a pebble in one section of the pond, and it creates a ripple. Ripple. You drop another pond, it creates another ripple. Create another pebble, another ripple. All sections will now have ripples. And soon, you will have a pond that is abuzz with ripples. Correct? And you engage everyone now. Compare that if I just drop pebbles in front. I just create ripples in front. And it will take a while before the rest of the audience at the back will get the message that I'm saying. Right? So that's the metaphor for eye contact. Facial expressions. Facial expressions, well, the general rule is you need to smile. Smiling does one of two things. Number one, for the speaker, it relaxes him. There's less tension when I smile. And for the audience, well, they feel a little more receptive. They see the speaker as someone who's, well, he's friendly, he's approachable. So that is what a smile does for the both of you. The key takeaway for facial expressions is you need to match the content.
Sorry.
When you have a storytelling, for instance, of a terrible car accident that ends in a hospital scene, you don't want to be smiling. So you need to match the content. Facial expressions are really easy to understand. Now, let me ask you one thing. Is eye contact and facial expression, are they similar? Facial expressions and eye contact. No, they're not. But they may be related. Eye contact is trying to establish engagement with the audience. Where facial expressions are, well, think of Facebook. You have emoticons, you have emojis, you have smileys. There's a wide range of emotions that you can see out of that. Something that if I could just backtrack a little, because I have a little more time. Oh, okay, just 5 minutes. Okay, a little more time on gestures. The key takeaway as far as gestures are concerned is this: they need to be comfortable. They need to look natural. Well, how does gesture become comfortable for you? You should be relaxed when doing them. They should not feel forced when you do them. If they feel forced, think of another gesture that will match the script in your speech. There are many that you can think of. Write them down alongside your script and then practice it. Rehearse it so that it becomes second nature to you. Otherwise, it looks unnatural, it looks artificial, it looks forced. So that's the key takeaway as far as gestures are concerned. Body language will do so much for your delivery. They will make a huge impact. In fact, 55% of it will more or less come from the body language that you will demonstrate in front of your audience. And my challenge to you, for your next speech, from what you've learned, apply what you learned from all those 4 components in body language and gestures. You don't need to incorporate all of them, just some of them in your next speech. And then add a little more in your next speech. And then a little more in your next speech. And soon, you will realize that your last speech was the best speech ever. Toastmasters